then that's how the Mayans died out. I always think back to this. I went to Palenque with this, because I do lots of Mexican food, and we were wandering around Palenque, these amazing ruins, and the chief archaeologist had said, we finally discovered why the Mayans, who were the most powerful people in the history of mankind, they ruled over this huge swathe of the Americas, and then they suddenly died out over about 50 years. And we've traced it back to soil erosion. They had a bit of a population boom, so they started farming too much. And meanwhile, they were making these killer pyramids which looked great and made them feel strong and brave. And they just basically cut down all their trees, and they had such bad soil erosion in the end with their high intense farming and the pyramid building that they lost the ability to grow food and collapsed. And you think, wow, that's what we're doing now. So looping back to chefs and schools, we buy wild farm flour because we know that flour is not spraying the soil with herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, it's regenerating the soil, and it's also producing this amazing stable of ancient varieties of wheats, which are grown for nutritional purposes, deeper roots, better in droughts, better at withstanding floods, more resilient, but basically got more nutrition in them in the first place. So the actual flour they're making the bread with is better for the kids. And better for the planet. Win-win.
Yeah. Doctor's Kitchen. Recipes, health, lifestyle. Tommi, thank you so much for making the time, for jumping on the podcast. I was so stoked to meet you at Melissa's dinner party to celebrate her book. And when you told me that you were listening to the pod, I had butterflies. So thank you so much. I really, really do appreciate your time.
Oh, I felt like I totally grabbed you, slightly fangirling. I was like, oh my God, it's Rupi in the room. Because I feel like I started listening to you in lockdown, and there's so much wisdom in your podcast. And I was so attracted to how you seem to get these brilliant brains from all sorts of disciplines and just extract such amazing nuggets from them. But also, I find it totally infectious, your just willingness and wanting to just learn from everyone and deep dive into all these things. It's so infectious. It's wonderful.
Thank you. That's so lovely of you. And we met up afterwards and we had coffee and we were just bouncing around ideas and stuff. And I already knew that you were somewhat of an activist, a real deep thinker about different topics that expand beyond our plate. But I really got a sense for just how many things you're involved in. But to anchor the listener, I would love to talk a bit about how you got into food, your earliest sort of memories of food. Because I gather you learned a lot from your mother. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, my brother and sister, I felt when I was young, I felt this kind of torture that they were the creative ones. And in the playroom, they were always creating these stories, these fantasies. And I'd just be always a bit bored hanging around at the edge thinking, but then I loved my mother and I kind of always wanted to be quite close to her. And then I found this amazing area in the kitchen that you could just play and create and do all this stuff. And from quite early on, I just remember being sandwiched next to the kind of stool. I'm sitting on a stool now around my table. We'd sit at the counter and she'd explain to me why she was slow cooking the onions, why she was cooking out the flour when she was making the bechamel to get the most flavour out and to stop it tasting raw. Just those really simple building blocks. But also because my father was really bad at making money, we always bought very kind of simple ingredients, humble ingredients, I say, but she was really good at getting the most amount of flavour. So we ate really well, and we, food was a massive thing growing up. On Saturdays, we'd have sandwich making competitions. Even BLTs were a bit of a ritual on a Saturday. But, when we went to stay with my granny in Wales, we'd buy this streaky bacon because the butcher slice it wafer thin so that when you put it in the frying pan, it was all crisp and sizzling and delicious. And then my mother would skin the tomatoes, dress them in salt, brown sugar, pepper, bit of vinegar, and they'd be on the table, iceberg lettuce in those days. And then we'd all make our own BLTs the way we kind of wanted them. And they were just, that's why the food was. My father, a special treat. We never ate in restaurants. When I did Masterchef later, and there's this Michelin star challenge where you have to make a plate of food that looks like a Michelin plate of food, I was completely out of sea. I was like, but I've never eaten in a Michelin star restaurant. That's not what we did when I was growing up. So, because occasionally for birthday, Dad would we'd go out very occasionally, and he'd just look at all the prices on the menu. He's a nightmare. And then everyone would be tense, and he'd be like, we could cook this so much better at home. So then after that, basically that's what he did. He had a motorbike, and he'd go off to Selfridges Food Hall if there was a real special occasion and buy a really nice, bit of steak or a really nice bit of fish, and then he would cook it. And that's how we celebrated, mostly at home, just around a kitchen table.
That's epic. Yeah. That frugality, I think, is sort of imbued into me as well. And it's funny you mentioned that, that sort of the picture you painted of you sat around the kitchen table on a stool and stuff. That's exactly how I learned how to cook from my mum, and just watching her with the careful use of spices, using one of those real typical sort of bowls with a lid on, of all the different spices in small tallies. And it's like, oh, this is when you put in the mustard seeds, this is when you put in the curry leaves, you want to flavor the oil and all that kind of stuff. So it's weird how you absorb all these different things, and when you go to teach other people about how to cook, you kind of assume that people have that knowledge. And actually, just through me doing social media, I've realized actually how little sort of education there is in this, and how little sort of sixth sense around cooking that there is just generally. I do want to talk about chefs in schools in a bit, but instead of jumping around, one thing that I love about your career is that you tried a whole bunch of things prior to going into cookery. What led you to go down those sort of quote unquote more traditional paths before you went into cookery?
Yeah, well, I went to a really academic day school, and it felt like I feel like, I don't know whether I made this up or not, but I feel like part of our school motto at one stage was get out of the kitchen, because it was a real feminist, our girls can do anything. We can churn out, bankers, lawyers, human rights lawyers, politicians. So I think, it was St. Paul's in London, and it was, food was seen, I'm really interested in this, and I feel it pervades politics, that food is seen as something other, that's not related to how you perform mentally, how you fare physically in life. Food is seen as almost a luxury, an extravagance, something that's set up in a little box kind of over in a corner. And definitely the idea that I could cook for a career was out of the question. In fact, there was a girl from school called Allegra McEvedy, who was a real bad girl when I was at school. She's the naughty one, and she did go off and become a chef. But it was she was she was the kind of bad girl of the school. She won't mind me saying this. She's really cool. So it didn't really seem like a possibility. And I've gone back now, and I talk at that school. And I'm always saying how fundamental, because what you're saying just then about our background knowledge when we were growing up, what that gives us, you and me, is the skill to coming home late at night, opening the kitchen, the fridge doors, and even if you've got apparently nothing in the fridge, you can still make something really delicious out of almost nothing that costs very little, because you just know that if you've got a bit of pasta or, a broccoli, or I was reading, actually, there's an amazing book by Tamar Adler, who is a wonderful food writer who trained at Chez Panisse. And her new book is about this. It's about, boiling a vegetable, how, you can put a head of broccoli or a head of cauliflower and boil it in water, and then use that water to boil pasta. Yeah. And then you might use that water again to cook some beans later on for eating on later in the week. And she always talks about, cook more vegetables than you need, because then tomorrow, the next day, you're set up already for another meal. And I think that's what the skills you're given by your mother when you learn that kind of intuitive cooking is. You just know, I had 10 people around last night for dinner, but I had no time to cook because I was out all day. But I knew I had some chicken liver pate in the freezer, because I always make it, because I always save the chicken livers from the chicken because I buy them at the market. And I knew I had some spiced nuts in my larder. I always have them because they're delicious and they're healthy, good snacks for the kids on the go. I had some homemade strawberry ice cream in the freezer. I had some homemade chocolate Pump Street chocolate and my brownies left over from a kid's fair, so I knew I could put those in the oven and get them all gooey. I had some really killer Neal's Yard creme fraiche that lasts forever. So that was great.
Wow.
Pick that out. And then on Monday, I made a Thai green curry paste from lots of stuff that I bought from this amazing Thai grocery. Very cheap. I bought some amazing Brussels sprout stems from the
Oh, the
market.
massive thing.
And
Yeah.
oh, that's so fun. And then the girls helped me prep them. We did that on Monday. On Tuesday, I think on Monday I did that. On Tuesday, I prepped the curry paste, put it in the freezer so it stay fresh. And then in the morning, I prepped the pumpkin that I'd also bought at the market. Amazing crown prince squash, delicious. Shoved it in the oven and said to my childminder, do you think you can take it out, in 35 minutes? So basically, dinner was kind of prepped.
Yeah.
And I think that's the joy of knowing how to cook, is it means you can eat delicious food all the time without spending a fortune. And for me, and we can jump around, but that's why Chefs in Schools, for me, is such an inspiring charity, because we are teaching generations of kids how to put food at the center of your life to give you pleasure, flavor, pleasure, but also health, mental health, physical health, affordability. It's all there in one thing. How did we put food on the outside when if we don't eat, we die? It's like a survival thing. And nutrition, like nourishing food, the heart of nourishment is that the food gives you something. You're not eating it for fun. I mean, you are hopefully eating it for fun because it should always be delicious. But it's supposed to actually nourish your body and mind. That's the whole point of it, right? It's to keep you alive. And we kind of lost that somehow, that idea. And so what people are eating now, they call it food. I would argue that ultra-processed food, we should ban them from being able to label it as food, because it's not food, because it's actually making people sick and it's not nourishing them. Surely when we say food, that idea of nourishment should be woven up in the word. Anyway, there you are. Quite passionate about the subject.
No. We're going to be jumping around a lot. I know we are. So that's cool. I feel like it's my unfair advantage, actually. It's my sort of privilege that I do have those skills that I can just open up the fridge or the store cupboard and I can just see, meals. I can see recipes. It's almost like I just paint them in my brain, and then I just sort of allow the recipe to sort of come together. And they're non-recipe recipes. There's this famous book, I think, by the New York Times of these recipes, and you can't cook them unless you're an intuitive cook, because they don't put any measurements in the book. There's just literally a list of ingredients, which I find amazing, but for like a novice cook, that's like a nightmare. And I chat to a lot of my friends and colleagues in medicine, and they struggle. And that's where you come to rely on ultra processed foods, takeaway foods, deliveries, all that kind of stuff, because you can't see how you can create a delicious bean stew using some frozen items in your freezer and the can of beans that you got in your larder. Like, you just can't see that. And what you described there about how you're cooking for 10 people, people hearing that would be like, how on earth do you do all these different things? But for you, it's just like, oh, I'll just put that there and put that there. And I've got a full meal for everyone. For most people, to cook for 10 people would take the entire day, let alone like looking after your kids in the midst of all that. So it is pretty incredible. And I think what you're doing with Chefs in School, why don't you introduce Chefs in Schools actually? What is the mission, the ethos, and what are you hoping to create out of that organization?
Yeah, so my kids' school had this amazing bit of land that was fairly derelict. So I got excited about saving this bit of land. I got a bit obsessive about the government selling off playgrounds. It was before my kids were at the school, actually. I kept passing it by. It's kind of on my road. And I kept thinking they've got to do something with this garden before someone decides it's a good idea to like sell it off and make some money. So I got quite obsessive about this, and with a girl called Laura Harper Hinton, who runs a group of restaurants called Caravan, who's also a local, we started doing these festivals in the school to raise money to help build the playground and start growing food in it. We had a dome and growing food and all that stuff. So we had these great festivals, we raised lots of money. But the school cooks, the school was lucky enough to have a kitchen, but the school cooks didn't know what to do with these seasonal vegetables. They didn't know how to incorporate in the food. Basically, they didn't have the skills. Almost at the same time, a guy called Henry Dimbleby, who wrote the food strategy, was having similar experiences in his local primary school. Grew up with really good cooking. His mother was a food writer, and the food in his primary school was rubbish. And so he put a tweet out saying, "Can anyone let me know? I need a school cook." And this amazing girl called Nicole Pisani, who's the co-founder of Chefs in Schools. So she was the head chef at Nopi, one of Ottolenghi's kind of stellar restaurants in London. And she was kind of burnt out, and she saw this tweet, or someone sent her it, and she became the school cook at Henry Dimbleby's kids' school and started really transforming the school food. I mean, she is hilarious. The stories she will tell you about, particularly mushrooms. Mushrooms is something that's so hard for any kid to love. She will tell you so many disaster stories about trying to put mushrooms and hiding them to food. But she is brilliant, and she and the MD now of Chefs in Schools is another amazing girl. Are really transforming school food. And basically, we all got around a table together because I, meanwhile, have been talking to a head of an autistic school in Shepherd's Bush who had transformed the school food. Food and eating for autistic children is really problematic. And she won an award, an Observer Food Monthly award, when I was judging one year. And I remember talking to her going, how did you do it? And she said, for me, that all the learning was, if you put a trained chef in, that is the transformative piece. Because a chef is trained to make food look beautiful, for texture, for colour. That's just their training. That's their innate. That's what they do, and they want to please people. They love people enjoying their food. That's any chef, their main motivation. When you look back in the journey of the childhood, me and my childhood, quite a problematic upbringing, quite a lot of stress and noise. When I fed people, I made them happy. That was basically my core motivation, was to please people and get that kind of positive feedback. And I reckon you can talk to 99% of chefs, and that was their fundamentals, something in their childhood, and that feeling of giving pleasure to people. So anyway, this guy transformed the food. And so Nicole and Henry and I and a girl called Jo Weinberg sat around a table at Wahaca, actually, and we were like, I think we should do this. And also what was really appealing about it is the business model, because, I am an entrepreneur. Wahaca is my group of restaurants, and I'm all for efficiency. So one trained chef in a school of 600, 700, 800 kids can transform the eating and the learning of that entire school. And that is basically the business model. And what we've discovered over 4 years, we've been in 80 schools, but we're going to be in 1,300 schools in the next 4 years, because our business model is completely, we've got it now. We've got it razor tight. It's working. We start off in London. We've got a chapter in in Sheffield, sorry. We've got a chapter just opening in the southwest, Cornwall, Somerset. We're talking to Scotland at the moment. It's so inspiring. But essentially, what we discovered was, because these chefs are so well trained, that even though we'd stopped feeding the kids this cheap beige food that basically had no nutrition, no fibre, and as some of the kids said, we used to fall asleep straight after lunch because they were so bogged down, these kind of simple carbs, high sugar spikes, and then those sugar crashes straight after lunch because they had no fibre, no kind of, that rainbow plate of vegetarian So we were feeding the kids. We do feed the kids vegetarian twice a week. So we're bringing generations of kids up to love our diversity of vegetables, which is great for the planet, great for their microbiome and gut health. But also we're making bread fresh from scratch. We're having the joy of cooking. And we're doing this, before Ukraine and that crazy, this crazy inflation of food costs, we were doing this at a saving of 50 pence per pupil per day. So we were saving that every day per pupil because the chefs just knew how to work ingredients. They just knew how to get the best of them. They knew how to make a killer dal, which, with the homemade bread, it's actually a meal, right?
Yeah.
It's got some lovely herbs on. They just knew how to cook, and they knew how to organise a kitchen. So even with the existing team of cooks. And you know what's so exciting about this? I was doing a fundraiser in my kitchen just here the other day, and one of the chefs from Chefs in Schools was this pretty handsome 30-year-old who was DJing at Frieze Art Fair that evening. He trained at St. John's, which got Michelin star. This was a cool kid living in Camberwell, really cool guy. And he has been a Chefs in Schools chef for 3 years. And he's there because he is the hero of the school. These school cooks no longer go through the back door where no one knows their name and they're the kind of unseen workforce. These guys are the heroes to the kids because they're making delicious, nutritious food, which kids love. This idea that you can just palm off fried stuff to kids because kids don't love vegetables. It's such a kind of, it's such propaganda. It's such a propaganda to have, the least and cheapest and easier option for kids. But I think we've got to like stop that rhetoric and bust that myth that kids don't like eating veg, because if you feed them delicious food, they will eat it. If you're going to boil the crap out of something and not season it, then maybe they won't like it. But if you're going to cook it beautifully and season it and put lots of herbs on, they're going to love it. So it's really inspiring, and seeing how that whole food approach, the teachers start enjoying the food, they're sitting down with the kids, the dinner ladies are having fun, and everyone's engaged and they're learning about food. It's so inspirational. And then the chefs get these amazing hours. Famously, chefs have bad working hours. They get long school holidays. They go home at 4. So it's great. It's really fun.
That's epic. Can we dive into, because I'm interested in the business model of this, and I think there's a nice sort of parallel between what I hope to do within hospitals as well. So with the chefs, so is it one senior lead chef that you have in the school? So
it's a head chef. So we model it just like a restaurant kitchen. So there's a head chef, you've got a couple of sous chefs under him, and the structure is exactly like a restaurant kitchen. And that really works. And then just like a restaurant kitchen, you start training up your team. So the guy who's on the pot wash, which traditionally in a kitchen is, someone who doesn't speak English, who's just come over from England, from all sorts of backgrounds. And you respect them from the start because they're doing the hardest job, which is the washing up. That's literally the hardest job. The pot washer in any restaurant's like the hero of the kitchen. And then you start training them and skilling them up. And that's how any restaurant kitchen is. You start skilling your workforce so they can start, moving up the ladder and taking on more responsibility. So that's exactly how it works.
Okay. And so the head chef, would you be paying them a similar wage to them working in any other restaurant in different parts of the country, whether it be York or Central London or Bristol? Is it like tiered according to a certain system, or?
So it has all, again, been completely skewed in the last 12 months by COVID, staff shortages, because right now the inflation rate of chefs in restaurant kitchens is crazy, because basically there are not enough people working in kitchens to support the amount of restaurants that are open. People can't get into restaurants on Mondays, Tuesdays, Sundays anymore because people just don't have enough staff. If you'd let refugees actually work for a living, earn money and pay taxes, you might solve that problem, but that's another story.
And with is it a similar situation to other public sector areas where you are allocated a certain amount per pupil or user of said service?
Yes.
And you have that pot of money, and then you choose from regulated suppliers. So you have to choose certain suppliers of produce.
So what we have done, which I think is really interesting, is because Nicole came from Nopi, which is a really well-respected, very upmarket, shishi restaurant in London. So she brought those suppliers that she used at Nopi to the table because she didn't see why she'd start using chicken nuggets, frozen chicken nuggets to feed the kids when she could bread her own chicken, and she knew that she could get the chicken from a good farm. Yeah. So the business model was set up with a set of suppliers who from the outset were really high quality. So I'd like to say climate friendly suppliers, because these are suppliers who were already fairly smaller scale, some of them, looking after their farms or their however they're producing their food, trusted partners that, when you work in when you go and eat in a really good restaurant, normally the chef has got quite trusted partners, and they're working people who already have a real respect for the ingredient, how it's grown, the earth and the soil, which is kind of all linked. And that's also what I love about the system, is this is a kind of anti-system, because you are starting to bring those producers who are looking after the environment in their small way into a kind of public procurement sector. So you're pulling people through to be able to give them more market share, in a sense, through these schools. And you're feeding kids food that's hopefully more nutritious because it's been grown in better soil. Maybe it's been sprayed less. I mean, definitely Wild Farms is a company I work for, which is an incredible company set up by Andy Cato, who's one half of Groove Armada. And he was
Oh, I didn't know
DJing.
that. Wow.
Yeah.
That's
So
so
he was
cool.
DJing in Ibiza, and he was on the kind of the bus, kind of roadie bus, and he read this piece about the amount of chemicals being put onto the soil in a kind of conventional system. And the piece at the end, there was a kind of killer line at the end that said, if you don't like the system, don't be a part of it. And it kind of was that light bulb moment. And he basically sold his music rights to Groove Armada and bought a farm in southwest France,
Oh,
and,
wow.
and moved his family out there. And then ensued a kind of 15-year battle because the farm that he bought, unbeknownst to him, the soil was completely knackered. So we
Oh,
don't really talk
man.
about soil enough. Like, I think in the general population now, we know about carbon, but for me, soil is a bigger threat to humankind as carbon, because we're killing our soil the way we're growing vegetables, spraying, nuking them really with herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, killing all the microorganisms, killing the birds and killing the worms and the bumblebees and the beetles, which support a whole web of life from kind of everything ground up. The soil that he inherited, basically you couldn't grow food in. He wanted to be an organic farmer, and he spent kind of 8 years trying to farm organically. And he realized that even that, although he wasn't spraying, he was still battling with weeds and how to grow the food. And he started really reading into it and discovering this regenerative farming, which essentially is growing food but putting back into the soil. So you're kind of nourishing the soil as you're extracting food. So you're not, we have this really extractive system, I think, in the capitalist West of always taking out from the planet and never thinking never thinking there might be a finite limit to how much we take out, and never thinking about what we can put back in. It's kind of mad. It's a bit like having children, right? You don't just, thrash them, do your homework, come out. At some stage you've got to tuck them up into bed, give them a bath, feed them something nice, and that they'll be better people the next day again. It's the same for farming, right? You've got to nourish the soil as well, knowing that it's got to rest and be fed well as well. Otherwise, obviously, there's a limit to it. Your child's become a monster and collapse. So that's what we're doing worldwide. We're losing 3 football fields a minute of good soil, and it's going to muck. And yet, 95% of the food we grow is in soil. So we're farming in a way that's killing the soil. And that's how the Mayans died out. I always think back to this. I went to Palenque with this, because I do lots of Mexican food. I flew out to Palenque with my parents. I was doing a work trip, and they came out, my youngest, and we were wandering around Palenque, these amazing ruins. And the chief archaeologist had said, we finally discovered why the Mayans, who were the most powerful people in the history of mankind, they ruled over this huge swathe of the Americas, and then they suddenly died out over about 50 years. And we've traced it back to soil erosion. They had a bit of a population boom, so they started farming too much. And meanwhile, they were making these killer pyramids that looked great and made them feel strong and brave. And they just basically cut down all their trees, and they had such bad soil erosion in the end with their high intense farming and the pyramid building that they lost the ability to grow food and collapsed as a species. And you think, wow, that's what we're doing now. So looping back to chefs in schools, we buy wild farm flour because we know that flour is not spraying the soil with herbicides, pesticides, fungicides. It's regenerating the soil, and it's also producing this amazing stable of ancient varieties of wheats, which are grown for nutritional purposes, deeper roots, better in droughts, better at withstanding floods, more resilient, but basically got more nutrition in them in the first place. So the actual flour they're making the bread with is better for the kids and better for the planet. Win-win.
Yeah, that's like a win-win. And we're definitely going to jump around because we're going to talk about something that you're doing very recently with Nesta and a couple of other organizations. Just to give the listeners some insight into how stretched the budget is per pupil. I wonder if you know some of the numbers that the actual price per pupil that the government give for school lunches and stuff.
I really wish I had Naomi, our MD, here with me, because she knows all these numbers back to front. I'm just a kind of humble trustee, but it is tiny. It is tiny, but also you will know from your work in hospitals, that it's
Yeah.
tiny, and that it's also tiny in prisons.
Yeah.
But what I'm most interested in is that we scrimp and save on this, upfront food cost. Even though we save that food cost in our kind of business model, although we put it back into salaries, so we didn't actually it wasn't cheaper. We put the savings of food costs back into the salaries and paid our people better. But what I find fascinating is that diet-related disease now, which incidentally is killing people more than alcohol or smoking, both of which are taxed. So you can talk about whether you should tax ultra-processed food, which is doing the same job, which is, not doing good for people. But it's costing the taxpayer, it's costing you and me £54 billion a year now, diet-related disease, and all the kind of ensuing fallout on the NHS, on people's health, on sick days. Diet-related disease, as you know, causes all sorts of maladies from, you'll know, heart disease and diabetes, all this stuff. So it's not as if this cheap food that for so long has been lobbied as, we're doing such a good service. We're feeding people on low incomes food that's affordable. It's not that affordable if you think it's costing us £54 billion a year and causing misery for people, because we are the most obese country in Europe now. We have the worst diet. And people will say, don't give me that thing. Don't tell me what I can eat. I've got free choice. And you're like, look, I love eating donuts and crisps and chips dipped in mayonnaise more than anyone else. But I know that I have got access to also eating fresh fruit and vegetables when I want, and I've got the skills to do it. We're talking about people they don't have a choice. The idea that they've got a choice is also another massive piece of propaganda. There are people who, single mothers who've got 2 jobs, they've got no time to cook. They might have no kitchen, or they might just have a microwave, because a lot of council houses have a tiny kitchen with a microwave in, and then a massive telly room. So there are so many people in this country, and George Monbiot said about 13 or 14% of people in this country don't even have access to kitchens. So they do not have a choice to eat better. There's no way they can. And they're surrounded by food deserts, which means they've got no fresh fruit and vegetables on sale near them. They've just got chicken shops. It is cheap at the point of buy, but not cheap further down the line. So this idea that we've got a choice, not to mention the advertising. I mean, advertising junk food to kids as well, and the hundreds of millions spent on making us want those really unhealthy, high profit numbers that are kind of high in the saturated fats and sweet. I mean, I think it's very clever, the marketing, that people who talk about public health are kind of made out as these killjoys of like, oh, you don't want to take away good food from us, and we want to eat lovely. I mean, we all want to eat delicious things, right? We all want to eat delicious things. But at what point do delicious have to not mean nutritious as well? And even nutritious sounds a bit boring, doesn't it? It sounds a bit like, you've taken the fun out of it. But, covering dal and ghee, like spice with, or oil, full of like the mustard seeds and the curry leaves, and and covering it in that oil, and then dumping your freshly cooked naan bread in it, and scooping it up, and fat. How delicious is fat? I'm always throwing fat all over my food. Who said food has to taste bad? Like, that's madness.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and I'm glad you brought up the P word, propaganda, because I think it is pervasive in that anyone who wants to speak out against ultra processed foods, cheap foods, is seen as elitist. And you definitely see it on social media, where you have people who kind of feel like they need to police the internet somewhat. I was chatting to Professor Tim Spector about this actually on the pod a couple of weeks ago, and he was sort of like grumbling about the same thing. Really, it's like we know through doing the studies, through reading the research, that ultra processed food is not satiating. It actually makes you eat more. The calories that you're consuming are that they have no nutritional value whatsoever. But there is this pervasive belief that the food industry is doing a service by making palatable, portable, very cheap food accessible to as many people as possible. And it's just not the case. And I think being antagonistic to that idea unfortunately brings a bit of shade to you. And so I'm glad, we're having this pretty open conversation about not only how we can introduce better nutrition into the food system, but also how you can do it on a budget and save food. So the fact that, putting a trained chef in schools can actually lead to a saving that you put back into salaries, that makes a happier environment and a more sort of cohesive environment, I think is a wonderful idea, and it's something that we should be adopting all over.
Yeah, and as you say, we should be adopting it in hospitals where
Mm.
people stay for longer in hospital because they're so malnourished while they're there. They actually get sicker. Or in prisons. Like, at what point did we think it was a sensible idea to feed a set of people that might be, some people might think, well, they've broken the law, they're on the fringes of society, why should we feed them good food? But unless you're feeding them food that makes them feel good, I mean, there's that high prevalence of mental health and people in prison, really poor mental health. How do they get there in the first place? If we look at prison offenders and like they're bad, just lock them up, throw away the key. What about trying to rehabilitate people? What about trying to nourish them, feed them, get them physically active, get them mentally working, and then thinking, oh, now I want to contribute to society. Now I feel I'm back on my feet. Maybe I'll even learn a skill in prison. That would be good, wouldn't it? So that when I get out, I'm actually then contributing to society, paying taxes, happy in my environment, looking after my family again. It's nuts the way we have this pervasive idea that good food is a luxury.
Mm.
Like,
Yeah.
how did that get marketed? It's really the idea that food keeps us alive. How is that a luxury?
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up the issue around prison food as well, because I was lucky enough to present at the Public Sector Catering Conference earlier this year, and so they had people from MOD, NHS chefs, and they're wonderful sort of competitions to create sort of like public sector caterers that we can shine a light on. And we had also some people from different prisons across the country as well. And the opinions that people have about prison food and whether we should be investing anything at all into prison food, super divisive. I'm definitely of the opinion that we should be trying to nourish people in their most vulnerable state, and that includes prisoners, because many of them, as you just mentioned, you just scratch away the surface and you realize that you're putting, not for everyone, obviously, there are certainly people who are just bad, but actually I would argue that's the minority. You scratch away at the surface and you realize you put anyone in that environment from childhood, the environments in which they grew up in, the people they were surrounded with, it's almost inevitable. And maybe, like, I've read a bit too much Gabon Mate, and like done a bit, I've read a lot of sort of opinions from different authors. But I'm certainly of the opinion that everyone deserves nutritious food, regardless of your situation, and particularly if you're in your most vulnerable, which is hospitals, prisons, and schools. So yeah, I just want to put it out there because I know that some people will definitely have some opinions on prison food, but that's where my mindset is.
But I think you're brilliant the way you say that. You scratch around, under the surface of every story of everyone who's in prison. And as you
Mm.
say, there are some people in there who are genuinely evil. And, it's better for society to have them there. But then so many will be, you'll find out that, they came from a broken home, they came from had single parents or no parents. There was no youth club near them. There was no kind of parental figure. There was nowhere to scoop them up. Maybe they got, kicked out of school. Another really criminal kind of policy where, if your kid's not doing well, you just get rid of them. They were picked up by a gang that became their family. They supported them.
Yeah.
They made them feel like they belonged for the first time. And then suddenly they're in a gang, and then they get locked up. So, yeah, I think we don't want to just forget these people. We're going to bring them back in society if we can, because apart from anything else, that's got to be better for the economy, right? Get those people back working, contributing, and being part of society.
Yeah, and I'm really interested in. I mean, we'll probably move on to a different subject because I could talk about chefs in schools the whole time. But I'm really interested in the return on investment because just to give some insight into when I did my little pop-up tour over the last couple of months in hospitals, we did like a little traveling circus of me and a couple of chefs, and they went into different locations. We're at Bradford, Royal Surrey, Norfolk Park, Barnet, and Addenbrooke's. And we saw the different environments for the hospital canteens, vastly different skill set of the workers, but also different facilities. Some didn't even have like proper ovens or anything. And the energy that having a like professionally trained chef brought to that little team was amazing. One of the best sort of compliments that I got wasn't a compliment to me. It was just one of the servers said, "I'm really proud to be serving this food." And you know, the color, the energy, the sort of response of the staff, it was all great. And so I think this whole concept of putting a professional, a chef, a leader into an environment where they can excite the team and actually create delicious, cheaper food is something that needs to be scaled. And so I'm just interested in the return on investment for putting chefs in different environments, and if you have any insights into that.
Well, I really want to talk about this thing that you just mentioned that I did for Nesta, because this is really related to this. So someone asked me, you know, they did this crazy thing like, Minister for the Future, if there's one thing you wanted to do to change things, what would it be? And the whole Chefs in School journey for me, which started off just as a passion project, you know, I cook on Instagram, I still run restaurants, I write recipes in The Guardian. That's kind of ostensibly what I do for a living. But then this has really taken over so much because I've seen the power of the change. So what you just said there, I think is really key too, that the sense of pride in those people in the kitchen was huge. So instead of having legions of workers, and, you know, the catering industries, you know, it's massive. It's the second biggest employer, cooking in the country. It contributes billions of pounds to the economy. We're talking about all cooking, like restaurants as well, but a lot of this is in the kind of public sector too. And the idea, you know, all of us, when we get out of bed, our primary motivation is to feel useful, to feel inspired, and feel like we're learning. I feel that in, you know, when you look at philosophy, as a human being, you know, we know when we're motivated and happy and in flow, that wonderful state of flow, which makes us truly happy beings. This is a bit of fluffy stuff, right? But that's how it's when you're learning, you get that real flow state where you feel deep happiness, is when you're learning and engaged in the thing you're doing, which often is work. It can be pleasure too, it can be meditation or cycling or swimming. But when you're in that state of flow in your workplace, that is one of the definitions of true happiness. And I love that Japanese... is it ayakada or whatever? Where they're like, if you can, ikigai, exactly, where you can find a purpose in life that is needed, does something for your fellow human beings, and you can also get paid properly for it. Feels that's the nub of it. So if we can create something where people are going to work feeling that joy and that deep-seated happiness, then you've got a better society. That's the fluffy stuff. The return on investment is really interesting too. So in Denmark, about a decade ago, they discovered, or were just like, we're fed up. Our waterways are really polluted. People can't swim in them. This is it's bad for the environment. It's bad for public health. We've got to do something about this. And someone came up with a bright idea of like, if we could just stop so many nitrates going into the water, fertilizer, herbicides, fungicides going off into our waterways, that would have a massive impact. Let's use public procurement as a way of good. So now hospitals and prisons and stuff, 30% of their food procurement, of the food they buy, has to be organic. Let's just legislate for that. But let's make this work. So let's set a lot of parameters around the fact this can really happen and work successfully. So we're going to really train those cooks in the prisons and the hospitals so that they actually know what they're doing with these organic ingredients they're suddenly getting in. We're going to have really clear labelling so that when they buy those ingredients, they know they're organic. And they set up another couple of parameters to help really make this project succeed. Private enterprise saw it so skillfully kind of set out that they were like, we're getting on board this. This looks like good. Like, this is like win-win-win. So we're jumping on board. And the whole project became so successful that today in Copenhagen, I think it's about 60% of public pure food is organic across the country. 60%. It's up to 90%. 60% across the country, but in Copenhagen, it's up to 90% because the whole project was done so successfully. So now we're going to talk about return on investment. So just the savings to the public health system, their version of the NHS, they reckon we're not even thinking about better soils, more biodiversity, happier farmers, and cleaner waterways. Because even the cleaner waterways will save the government a couple of billion, because it costs a lot, right, to clean up your waterways and the kind of ensuing fallout from polluted rivers. So just the cost of the National Health Service, for every euro they spent in setting this project up, they're saving, so one-off cost of every euro, they're saving annually 35 euros just on the public health service. Because the people now, the citizens are being fed better, they're getting a bigger range of vegetables in their diet, they're having more fibre, which no one talks about enough. How much fibre is in ultra-processed food? Almost none. It's just kind of, contorted, processed stuff that manages to stick together and last on the shelf for 5 months or a year or whatever. So no one's getting enough fibre, which is one of the key attributes of gut health is, are we eating enough fibre? That's feeding all those amazing microorganisms. So suddenly they've got a nation of much healthier people. And we know what the NHS is doing here. I mean, all we ever do is turn on the radio and you hear how diabolical the state is of the play. They reckon by 2050, we're going to be spending more money on diet-related disease in the NHS than all of the cancers combined. And that's just nuts. So if we can create this system where we know we're going to save money, there might be a tiny bit of upfront cost, but we can probably actually even negotiate that, because contrary to what the massive food people will say to you, you can save money on that food cost. And in fact, what we want to do is we want to talk to the likes of Compass and all these big contract caterers and say, come on, you want to hit your carbon agenda, you want to get to net zero, so let's help you get there too, because you've got kids, you know what the state of play is, you know the NHS is crumbling, and if your mother gets a call out, like has a fall, she wants to get on an ambulance and get to school. So you know that deep down you want to do the good too. So even if you're head of Compass or working Compass, you want to do the right thing. So let's all do the right thing, get this thing in motion. So I wrote this piece and I was like, come on, let's just do it. Let's make sure that, I think in the piece I wrote for Nesta and Prospect magazine, I was saying, let's make 50% of public procured foods in all prisons, hospitals. Social care is a big one. Let's make them regenerative, because regenerative farming now is all it can is, should be organic, but it's about rewilding that soil. In fact, we want to rewild the plate too. There's an amazing girl who works with Professor John Crawford, India. I wish I could remember her surname. He talks about rewilding our plates. But by rewilding our plates, we're rewilding our gut biome, we're rewilding nature. It's a win-win-win. We're massive savings in the NHS, happier, healthier nation, all thriving. I like to, like healthy food gets such a bad rap. But I like to think, imagine if we're all animals, right? We know we're animals. I mean, we think too much, we're basic animals. I like to think of us like tigers in the jungle. Do you want to be like a fat, kind of overweight tiger who always feels tired? Because basically they're eating too many like hamburgers and Jaffa cakes, and so they can't even leap to catch their prey because they're basically just too heavy. Or do you want to be the type of tiger who's like running around, playing with your kids, leaping through tree to tree and across the branches and catching things and feeling fit and active and well? So I think, healthy food is not bad. Feeling good is feeling good. Like if you eat well and eat good food, so boring to have so much passion about one thing, isn't it? I feel like go on and on about the same things, but it's so exciting how possible this all is.
You're speaking to the right audience, to be honest. So, the Doctor's Kitchen listeners and community members are like really passionate about this subject, as am I, as are you. And, we can talk to the cows come home about this because it is exciting. I think it's the most exciting place to be, regardless of what industry you're in, whether it's medicine, whether it's ESG, whether it's farming. I think nutrition and food and what we put on our plates has just such a massive impact. So no, I mean, talk away. I'll definitely look up rewilding our plate. I love that sort of the analogy and the concept of rewilding. I wonder if people haven't listened to some of my podcasts with Abby Rose, who talked about regenerative farming and her biodynamic farm in Chile. What's sort of like the too long didn't read of regenerative farming compared to organic or conventional? What is regenerative farming to you? How do you sort of explain that to people who haven't come across the concept before?
So essentially what you're doing is you're being really mindful that underneath our feet, there's this incredible thing called soil. And in a teaspoon of soil, there are more microorganisms than there are people on this planet. There is so much teeming life in soil, and there are amoebas and nematodes and protozoa and fungi and bacteria, and they are having sex with each other, and they're eating each other, and they've got carnal lust, and they're all working together to create this process, which essentially is photosynthesis. So they're taking all the kind of energy from the sun, and they are sucking out all the carbon from the atmosphere, and they're chomping out oxygen as their byproduct. And in the process, they're creating food, which is the plant life, and that is basically the fundamentals of regenerative farming, is understanding the interplays between all these incredible microorganisms who are all doing all this crazy stuff underneath our feet, which we're only just beginning to get to the tip of knowledge about. I mean, penicillin is a fungi that came from underneath our feet. You know, they are building buildings out of fungi from underneath our feet now. They are doing so much. There are fungi that eat nuclear waste. There are fungi that can eat all sorts of waste and churn out edible mushrooms in the process. So we are just on this tip of incredible knowledge about the fungi. And regenerative farming essentially takes that knowledge and nurtures that process. And the more you nurture it, so you can think of really healthy soil as being a giant sponge. And that giant sponge has air pockets where it can suck in the carbon and process all the time. It can also suck in water. So when we have intensive flooding, it has much greater capacity, because healthy soil basically becomes a bigger and bigger sponge the healthier the soil is. And so really healthy soil is this giant sponge. And so when it rains a lot, it can keep that water and retain it. And then when you've got drought, it's already got all that water in it. So it's got that water the root systems can access. If you've got really unhealthy soil, you've got no sponge, the water kind of runs off. There's a kind of fairly non-permeable film on top of the soil. And you can see that with flooding, that just the water runs off and the topsoil runs off. You can see in bad flooding, the mud that goes off into the rivers. And that is all the essential topsoil that we use to grow our food in. So regenerative farming basically harnesses all this knowledge we're getting now to nurture that process and have really healthy soils, so that all these microorganisms can do their stuff, which is essentially sucking out the carbon, chomping out the oxygen, but in the process creating plants that are high in phytochemicals, high in micronutrients that feed us all the good stuff that, you know, a lot of foods these days don't really contain. So it is, you know, for me, regenerative farming is putting away the herbicides and the pesticides and the fungicides, because healthy soils and healthy plant systems, we're also talking about microdiversity of plant systems, because there's nowhere in nature that you just have one crop growing in a field. You can't see that in nature. Everywhere in nature there's diversity. So even all those microorganisms I was talking about, the bacteria, the fungi, the nematodes, there's a diversity of them, like in our gut, that is a healthy system. If you take away that diversity, you're making a very, weak system, really prone to attack. And that's where you start getting big fungicides and, you know, massive weeds, because they are sprouting up in a system you created that's devoid of diversity. So in all our farming now, conventional farming, we just grow monocrops. And the only way we can grow them, because they've got no complex systems, they've got bad soil, is we just nuke them more and more with these herbicides, pesticides. I mean, the herbicides, glyphosate, but lots of people are making the new generation herbicides that aren't no longer called glyphosates because they're beginning to get a bad name. But they're all linked to, you know, autoimmune diseases, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's. I mean, why do we think there's this crazy rise in Alzheimer's? It's just not magic. You know, it doesn't just suddenly happen that we all got older and we all started getting Alzheimer's. There are reasons. You know, if you nuke the plants that we later eat with chemicals that were invented in the Second World War to kill people, then, and that would kill, you know, the plants and the microorganisms, then obviously they're going to be bad for us. So regenerative farming is about basically throwing away those chemicals, which are oil rich, oil hungry anyway. And the farmers are having to use more and more of these to get the same crop yields, and they cost a lot of money. Actually, if you throw away those chemicals and start growing these amazing practices of regenerative, the farmers are actually making more money, because half of their costs get thrown away. They're no longer dependent on this oil-rich system of farming, full of the chemicals and the nitrates, and then they're growing really healthy food. And so that bit I was talking about that I wrote for Prospect was like, let's just make a movement. Let's make it completely unavoidable that we do this thing, that let's say by 2030, or even let's make it earlier than that at least 30% of our public procured food, which we spent £2 billion on a year, is regenerative. Because just think about the impact that would have. We could create, much better food at no increase in food cost. We would save vast amounts of money on NHS. We'd start being able to swim in our rivers and seas again because they'd suddenly be cleaner. And it would be an absolute win for the environment. I think, it's great. You can do it in hospitals. I can do it in schools. We'll get someone in our prison to do it. We can make this happen.
Yeah,
woo,
absolutely.
come the revolution.
I think that's a really good explanation of regenerative farming. I think there's so many parallels between how we forgot about the importance of our digestive system and our gut microbial population that we collectively call the microbiota, or the genetic diversity being the microbiome. And it's also interesting to note that we sort of forgot about it, even though it's very marked in our history. So if you look at traditional Chinese medicine, you look at Ayurvedic medicine, even Mayan medicine, I'm sure, although I haven't looked into it, they all talk about the gut as the root of all health and the root of all disease, right? Like my mum and dad have always known about this, and, making sure that you're looking after your tummy with lots of delicious, diverse ingredients. It's simple, it's cheap. And in the same way, I think our understanding of our soil system is having a bit of a revolution as well. More people are understanding the importance of not just adding nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium fertilizers, but actually nurturing the soil's ability to look after itself and provide nutrient-rich nutrients to our crops that become better for us and better for the planet. And this idea of investing in soils to mellow climate change as well is again something that I think a lot more people need to understand and invest in time. But it does require some lateral thinking and forward thinking by people in government, because you're not going to see the return on investment immediately. It's going to be further down the line. And because we live in this sort of like very short cycle political system, no one's really willing to stick their neck out and invest in this, as we're seeing right now with offshore and onshore wind arguments and stuff.
I find really interesting.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
No. But what I find really interesting too is that we think, intuitively, you feed a plant nitrate, you give them the good stuff, and then they grow, right? But actually, they've shown that if you don't feed them the nitrate, then the plant has to do the work itself.
Yeah.
It has to create those partnerships with the fungal networks, and all those bacteria then kick into their system. And the process by which the plant has to do the work itself and find those nitrates itself already existing in the natural food web or the wood, then that is what creates those healthy, diverse plant systems. That's what makes the plant strong and healthy and actually nutritious. If you just give them it straight away, it's a bit like that, I guess. They're metaphors in daily life, aren't they? If you actually do the work, you get the benefit. If it's just handed to you on the plate, you don't probably learn as much.
Yeah, I think it's almost like multivitamins. I think with humans, like, yes, I could just take a crushed vitamin tablet and that'll give me all my calcium and potassium needs and all the rest of it. But am I going to be healthy? No, I'm not. I'm going to survive, but I won't be thriving for sure. I'll just be, a withered sort of shell of a human if I was just relying on that. And there's so much intelligence in the food that we consume that we don't really appreciate. And I think the intelligence of our soils is something that is sort of, completely lost. I mean, my family, we come from Punjab. Obviously, you're aware of the farmer protests from last year, and that sort of reliance on petrochemicals in the agricultural industry and stuff. It leaves a bit of a bad taste in my mouth, because I see the sort of struggles of farmers, and farmers just aren't championed enough in the same way chefs aren't championed enough, I think. And I think we need to really adjust our appreciation for people who are foundations for life on Earth, and they have such a critical role in this new era of diet-related illness and climate change. These guys should really be put on pedestals.
But what I find is exciting, again, is you talk about policy change and the investment as being a kind of barrier to making this stuff happen. But what I find really exciting is that if you follow the money's wise, right, and investment is wise. So Alison Rose is a great hero of mine. She is the chair of NatWest, and she realised recently that 3% of her customers created 20% of her carbon emissions. So as a company trying to get to net zero, she knew that this tiny percentage of her clients were creating massive amount of her emissions. They were farmers. So she started really drilling down into that because, conventional farming is really, emits so much carbon and is so reliant on this chemical hungry way of farming. So she started really exploring to this. And actually, if you look at where the smart money is going, investments now, look at farms and how are you farming? Because if you're farming in a way where your soil runoff is increasing, you have to keep putting on these nitrates where the cost of them is going up all the time. You're not building a resilient business. You're not building a business that I really think I should be investing in, because I can see how it's going to be falling down. Your costs are rising, your yields are falling, and meanwhile your soil's kind of being degraded all the time. Let's look now at a regenerative system where you're investing in the soil. We know that you're in a drought system, you've got better soils, you've got more water retention. We know when it floods, you're actually not losing that water or the topsoil, it's actually sucking all that water in, so you're not getting that same runoff. Your crops are protected. That's the type of business model I want to invest in. So I think although government's probably a bit behind and slow to catch up on, business isn't. Business is really seeing, so you're using a diversity of wheat crops now, and they've all got deeper root systems. So in a drought, this conventional wheat that we've grown just for yield, they've got really short roots. So they will be the first ones to go. But these ancient varieties of wheat have got these really deep root systems that can access all that deep down water. That is more resilient. That's the business that I'm going to put my money in, because I'm a smart businessman. And I think that's what's really interesting now, is people are looking deeper into these things. And that's where the money will be going.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love Wahaca, but I don't think we're going to get a chance to talk about Wahaca and your story today. But I wanted to dive into Denmark a bit, because I think it's an incredible example of what can be done. So, what was the time period that they made these changes in procurement of organic produce for the public sector? Because that seems like that's huge, and it's an amazing example of the fact that it can be done at a country level.
Yeah, so I think, and I need to, now that my piece has come out, I can really start shouting about it, and I'm banging the drum. I've got to deep delve in, but I feel it was about, it was kind of set up about 10 to 15 years ago. But the impact has been fairly quick. The impact on the waterways was very quick, because, you stop putting chemicals in the land. That's quite a quick turnaround for the rivers.
Yeah.
Start regenerating the soil. What I think is interesting about this is it was just organic food. If you put it to regenerative, then you're having a much more positive impact, because you're not just having a neutral thing of no chemicals, you're having a positive thing of actually nourishing the soil at the same time. And then the health impact is probably a bit slower, but not that much behind. Because if you think about having someone in hospital, if you start feeding them better food, pretty quickly they're going to start feeling better and getting better. Like, anyone who's sick and you feed them some lovely chicken soup or, vegetable broth or whatever it is, that improvement's quite quick. So actually, it's a pretty fast turnaround, this system. And we can see that in chefs in schools. We go into a school and within a term, the kids are saying to us, it's amazing. I don't fall asleep anymore after school. I feel well. I feel healthy. I can concentrate in class. So these turnarounds actually are pretty fast. So which is very positive as well. And it's lovely you mentioned Wahaca, because I feel like at Wahaca, which we set up 15 years ago, we always wanted to have a menu that was really high in vegetables. So half our menu is vegetarian, and it was always something we wanted to do, not just because we love vegetables, but because we thought it was great to give people a choice of having slightly more affordable food, but because we always wanted to put better meat on our menu. So all of our meat at the moment is free range, and our beef is grass fed. And we wanted to invest in better quality meat, but then we want to have an option for people if they didn't think they could afford that, beautiful free range pork per taco, then they could have the delicious kind of ancho mushroom taco with crispy beetroot and jalapeno aioli or something, and have an option. So that I think has governed a lot of this thinking, and I think that is a really good model, because we know we've got to eat less meat to be climate friendly, but that doesn't have to be bad. Just get delicious vegetables on your plate, and that rainbow of them, diversity, and it's a delicious journey. As all your followers know, vegetables can be so delicious. And for a cook, I love the creativity of cooking vegetables. It's so fun looking at a piece of broccoli or courgette or a beetroot, knowing there are so many ways you can cook that thing. It's like, what am I going to do with it today? Am I going to shred that beetroot and turn it into a fritter? Am I going to make a soup? Am I going to deep fry it into a crisp? It's just like, where am I going to take this? Steak, great, pan fry it. How creative is that? I can do a different sauce. So I think it's really fun cooking vegetables.
Yeah, no, I think from a chef's point of view and a recipe creator's point of view, it's an awesome challenge. I did something recently with the BBC, trying to create some budget friendly meals using what we tend to find in people's pantries. And boy, is it hard. It is really hard to really extract flavor. And I want to make sure that I'm putting in a certain number of vegetables. We're prepping them in a certain way. I wasn't allowed to use the oven, all these different things. And it's challenging, but it really does force you to get creative, which I think is awesome. On the note of, sorry, we're jumping around a bit, but on the note of chefs in schools, so you want to try and get to 1,300 schools. When's that target? When sort of the
4 years?
4 years. Wow.
So
okay.
4 years. So we've been in existence for 4 years, and we've done 80. But we've nailed our model now. So this is the fun bit now, right? We want to get in as many schools as possible. But more excitingly, we've got our training program. We've got it all set up. So we've got the capacity, we feel, to be in half of the schools in the UK in the next, let's say, 6 to 8 years, 8 to 10 years, because we've got a ready to go training program that's been tested, that we can hand over to anyone who's interested. So maybe we can even give that to a hospital or a prison. You think bigger than this, because it's basically ready to go. So we're on a kind of bit of a fundraising mission, but we're also just we just want to get the word out as much as possible. I mean, our motto is better is possible, because it is possible. It's completely possible. So again, using that propaganda word, better is so possible and affordable.
How many schools ballpark figure? How many schools are there in the UK?
26,000.
26,000. Okay, so you're going to get into around 5% or so in 4 years.
That's us. That's us with our people.
Yeah.
But then our training program could get into another 13,000, we reckon. In the next.
Yeah, that's epic. So you're literally at that blitz scale. To use sort of a Silicon Valley term in tech, that sort of period, which is super exciting. I mean, it's super nerve-wracking, but it's super exciting. And if you could nail that trainee program, I don't see why, if you've shown in one public sector the ability to change, you couldn't do it in parallel in others. Because I've seen firsthand how the impact of just having a chef in the hostel environment really invigorated everyone and create the excitement and create delicious food. So that would be amazing. Absolutely.
But also what's so exciting about it is that it's what I find really exciting about it too is you can work with the big public sector caterers, and you can help train their cooks, and you can help give them recipes, and because I think everyone wants to do better now. Everyone knows, the state of play. You look out at the floods and the extreme heat, and all around the world, we're seeing these kind of weather patterns. Everyone wants to make a difference now and put their part in. So, we want to engage with everyone, because I talked to a whole lot of public sector caterers the other day, and as you say, that everyone wants to do this. That everyone's, it's like we're just pushing a door that's already a bit open. Everyone knows they've got to make changes, and so if you can make it easy and fun and exciting along the way, so you're part of this really inspiring movement, then I think that's the way to go.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, someone who's coming at this from not just a charitable perspective and an activist perspective, but a business perspective, such as yourself, I think is critical, because at the end of the day, organizations, including the NHS, are looking at the bottom line with all this stuff. And it's, in the UK, it's a bit of an ugly thing to talk about, business, but it's absolutely necessary, and the commercial element definitely needs to be there. And I don't want to, I want to play devil's advocate with the Denmark example, because I know I get a lot of pushback for thinking about ways in which to improve the health system / that diet related disease bill every year. We spend billions on type 2 diabetes and many other preventable conditions. And my sort of running theory is not theory, it's the reality is that nutrition has an impact on every disease state, whether it's not just cardiovascular disease and obesity, it's mental well-being, it's women's health, cancer, everything, which is why we talk about
Alzheimer's. They're now saying Alzheimer's. They're saying
huge, absolutely,
I mean, crazy.
Absolutely. It all comes down to the gut and what you're feeding your microbiota. So yeah, it's a massive issue with Denmark. I imagine the pushback you're going to get is, well, Denmark's very different. They have a completely different taxation system. They pay way more in. This is just top of the head from like background knowledge. I think they pay a lot more in tax generally at a population level. Maybe they have pre-existing farms that are organic, or and they deal with less people in their public sectors. And I'm sure the population size is a lot smaller. What do you say? What are sort of like your throwbacks to those points that are inevitably gonna come up?
So one, we're already doing it. We're already doing it through chefs and schools. It's effectively what we're doing. We use wild farm flour. We get better quality meat from good providers. We know that our vegetables come from good growers. So we're already doing it. And we've proved that we can still do that and save money. So that's one thing. Two, definitely they've got different population, but we've got more workers. So we've got more people to feed, but then we've got more workers to feed them. So, and also we've got lots of people who are looking for work. So let's create jobs that are inspiring, well paid, and get people motivation to get out of bed in the morning, because we can create those jobs, because we've seen how even the cool 30-year-old who trained at Michelin Star Kitchen and DJs at Freeze Art Fair in his weekends, he likes cooking these scenarios because he's motivated, he's a hero. It's an inspiring job. And what better thing than to create inspiring jobs that people want to work in society? Yeah. So that's another thing. And then taxation. Again, we're already doing it. We were already saving money in these schools. I think there is always some upfront cost in making a change. And that's the most thorny thing, is who's going to do that investment? But when you can see the savings so quickly, and I'm going to really drill down into the detail now. Give me some homework to do to go and really examine that Denmark model inside out. So next time I'm on a podcast, I'm going to be throwing back these answers straight away. But if you can get such quick change, then there are ways to finance these things, I really believe. And even if you just start small projects, I was talking to someone in Jersey just before I came on board, and he was really interested in doing a microcosm of it in Jersey, which is kind of a closed system. And then really learn how public health is. But I feel because we're already doing it in chefs and schools, and because projects like this are sparking up in hospitals around the country, there are examples of some hospitals doing better. I feel that that's not really a bar. I think we've kind of proven that it's not really a bar. There does need to be, I feel there needs to be a cross-bench agreement. It's the right thing to do, but it feels like it's a really low investment, and you can get private enterprise, you can get banks involved. I talked about NatWest wanting to do the right thing. They want that, they've got a real motivation to get those 2 or 3% of customers doing much better for their emissions, for the NatWest emissions. So it's in their interest to get those farmers on the right journey. So we're providing route to market for the farmers, because the farmers also need to know if they're creating these food products that are better for everyone, they need to know they've got a market for them. So we're also creating a market to pull the farmers on this better journey in the total absence of legislation at the moment. So that's also a really good thing. You know, you're pulling everyone in the same direction.
Yeah. We definitely need to talk more about this. I'm super excited for you, and I know that if there's anyone that's going to make massive change, as you've already demonstrated through chefs in schools and the rest of your team as well, you could definitely do it in this environment too. I got to tell you a really funny story. So you know when you were on Saturday Kitchen, I can't remember if I already told you this, but and you were doing a recipe from your meat free Mexican. That's the name of the cookbook, isn't it? That came out earlier this year.
Yeah,
You made this. It was incredible. This meal you made the sort of sauce, the salsa from scratch. I think it was called salsa negra. And me and my wife, we were like, oh, we're definitely going to make this at home, but we didn't have any of your ingredients, so we made it and we tried it and we shared it with one of our friends called Liz. It's like, Liz, you got to try this recipe. We made it a bit different, but you got to try it. And we sent her a voice note and we said, instead of red wine vinegar, we used the sherry vinegar. we used instead of like the coriander, we had to use parsley. We basically completely butchered your recipe. And she was like, you haven't made that recipe. You've literally just made something completely different. So it might taste great, but it's definitely not her recipe.
It's inspired by.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I said.
Yeah, I mean, I think we get a bit too precious about these things. Like, if a recipe gets someone in the kitchen cooking, that's a win, right? I mean, all of my food writing, I feel like it's a win if someone has got in the kitchen and played with some ingredients and made something they like the taste of afterwards. That was so nice. Thank you.
That's my sentiment exactly.
Negra, by the way.
Yeah,
that salsa negra, I've got a jar of it in my cupboard here, and I put it on everything. I just love that salsa.
Good. So
transforms anything. Yeah.
Oh, it's amazing.
Thank you for
I did make it the right way afterwards, but yeah, I do want to mention that because as a recipe creator myself, I don't mind if people go completely sideways on the ingredients as long as they enjoyed it, they got in the kitchen, it's inspired them to make something different. That's great. But yeah, no, it was quite funny how we just completely did it. And Liz thought it would be like the worst thing. Anyway, thank you, Tommi. You're an absolute star. I can't wait to chat to you again, and hope we can do it in person and maybe even in the kitchen as well. That'd be awesome.
Oh yeah, let's cook. Love to cook. That'd be great. Cool. All right, lovely. Thanks so much for having me, Rupi.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure.